Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm just going to do a little introduction right now. I know that everyone here knows me, but I know that the people who will watch this might not know me. So I'm just going to tell a little bit about what I do, who I am, and then I'm going to introduce our speaker of today. So my name is Dr. Alcabasius, also known as Professor Sabella here at Kingsborough. And aside from teaching the history of the Nazi Holocaust, I'm also the research and programming director of the Holocaust Center. And today's event is sponsored by our center. Our guest is Mr. Leo S. Ullman, who was born in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, in July 1939. He spent most of the Second World War in hiding, separated from his parents and other relatives. His experiences are chronicled in his memoir, 796 Days Hiding as a Child in Occupied Amsterdam during World War II. Let me just show you this. And also in the documentary, there were good people doing extraordinary deeds, which we will screen today. So Mr. Ullman came to the United States with his family in 1947 to start a new life. A Harvard and Columbia University graduate, Mr. Ullman practiced law for more than 30 years. With respect to his roots, Mr. Ullman served as a director of the Anne Frank Center, USA, for 2 decades, and as its chairman for 7 years. He has also served many years as the chairman of the Foundation for the Jewish Historical Museum in Amsterdam. He and his wife, Kay, have co-sponsored the exhibit State of Deception, the Power of Nazi Propaganda of the United States National Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., for which he has also served as a member of its development committee. Now, earlier this year, I attended Mr. Ullman's lecture at the Wagner College Holocaust Center. And we immediately bonded. Well, basically, I was introduced by one of the organizers, and we immediately bonded over our shared Dutch roots. Mr. Ullman's Dutch is impeccable, and we really enjoyed speaking Dutch to each other. And he invited me for a luncheon at the Harvard Club in Manhattan. And we spoke for hours about his experiences, about his work, and also my current research project, and my work at the Holocaust Center. And we talked about an event series I had created as part of my Mellon Foundation project, Children of the Klan. And part of this event series is a photo exhibit titled Hate and Humanity, which documents several neo-Nazi and Klan groups in the United States and zooms in on the participation of children and women. Leo has been extremely supportive and immediately recognized the importance of the event series in general and the exhibit in particular. He decided to sponsor the latter. The exhibit will be on show at Stockton University's Holocaust Center in the fall of 2023. The exhibit will be hybrid, so our Kingsborough students, can explore it as part of my class. In addition to sponsoring the exhibit, Mr. Ullman has also donated, as you all know, 35 copies of the abridged version of his memoir, which is this one, to our Kingsborough students. And based on this memoir, my students have formulated interview questions. They will use the answers to these questions in their biographical essays about Mr. Ullman. I'd like to thank Mr. Ullman for his support and generosity and for driving all the way from Long Island to our campus. We are incredibly grateful to have you here today. So what we're going to do first, we're going to watch the documentary, which is very similar to the memoir, but of course, visuals always is a different experience, right? And then afterwards, we will start our Q&A. As I said before, we're going to do, each group is going to do one question, and if we have time left, we can then move on to other questions. And if any people are here today who are not part of the class, feel free to chime in after all of the questions have been answered of the students. Now, before we start showing the documentary, let's give Mr. Ullman an applause. Thank you so much for coming.
My name is Leo Ullman. I was born on July 14, 1939, Bastille Day in Amsterdam, Holland. I was born to parents who were leading a wonderful life. My mother's family had long been in Amsterdam. Her father had a very successful diamond cutting business. My father's family came from Germany, and he came to Holland in 1932 when he graduated high school, and met my mother through a cousin when he and that cousin were both employed by the bank, or the largest Dutch department store in Amsterdam. Immediately after I was born, we moved to an apartment in Amsterdam South where the better-to-do Jewish families lived. It was a very nice apartment. Once the war started and the Germans took over Holland, one of their first decrees was that all Jewish people had to come to Amsterdam. And so as a result of that, in that apartment, we suddenly had grandparents, uncle and aunt, and a great-grandmother. And somehow we got along, and we lived in that apartment until the decision was made that we had to go and die. We come to live like rats, as they call it. They were absolutely certain that if they were caught and deported, it would be certain death. Going into hiding was influenced by two specific events. One is that the Germans, or the Dutch acting on behalf of the Germans, warned them that they had to be ready to be deported within the next days. In the meantime, my mother's sister, whose husband was extremely active in the resistance, and her children were ultimately picked up. And even though they were first put in a jail, and my grandmother on my mother's side was able to keep them from being deported for a while, ultimately they were deported, notwithstanding their efforts. I wouldn't say it was an easy decision, because it's a very, very, very difficult decision. Appreciate that my parents had lived a very, very good life, and they had zillions of friends, and they had the means to do most anything they wanted, and all of a sudden, they had to disappear. I would act up and make noise and yell and scream and cry, whatever, so they could not even consider taking me to die. And that was a very difficult decision. A decision that my grandparents, my paternal grandparents, really resented at the time. They thought it was a horrible thing to get rid of their child. But my parents made the decision that was the only way to survive. They had to figure out how to go into hiding and what to do with me. And for that, they had an awful lot of time. A lot of my mother's friends were very active in the resistance, in the Dutch resistance. It was a passive type of resistance where, you know, they destroyed records. civil registry if they were caught, and the Germans were after these people. They would be summarily executed or shipped to ultimately to Dutch. The decision was made to hand me over to a resistance group that placed Jewish kids. It was important to wean me away slowly. I was sent for days at a time to the homes of my mother's sorority sisters. And so I would feel comfortable not being with them for stretches of time. It was almost given that when you went into hiding, the parents would not know where you were or with whom you were being located, because that was part of the risk that people would talk inadvertently or somehow risk disclosing the hiding place. I was placed initially with a young man who lived outside Amsterdam and who was newly married. His name was Anton Schimmel. It didn't work out very well because he and his wife were having marital difficulties, and I'm sure I exacerbated those severely, and they decided that they couldn't keep me. And I was then placed for a short period, an interim period, with a sort of orphanage. And at that point, Anton Schimmel's father and mother decided that they liked me, and they got me out of that orphanage, and they took me in. They only knew that I was a Jewish child. They were in their 50s. They had 2 adult children, and then they had an adopted daughter named Tilly. There were these people who were, I'd say, ordinary people, though they weren't ordinary, who made extraordinary gestures to save other people whom they didn't know, without any thought of any benefit from doing that, except thinking it was the right thing to do. In September of 2017, we went to visit some of the places that were meaningful in my early life. We went and visited my hiding place during the war, which was an apartment. I was placed eventually with the people in this apartment, whose names are Hendrik and Janetje Schimmel Mansholt. This is the first time that I've been back. There we were lucky to find a student who lived in the apartment, and he graciously let us in. Don't you be here alone? Okay. It was a very generous gesture on his part to let us know, and it was wonderful for me to see where I was in the first time, in fact, since the war. I think that may have been my room, and I shared a room with my war sister, Tilly. Tilly was 13 years older than I was. For the first few weeks, perhaps, they let me out. They dyed my hair blonde, and they let me play outside. But after a couple of weeks, they decided no longer to do that. So I basically stayed in the apartment for the entire war. During the night, we had to blacken the windows by pulling down dark shades so that the Allies and perhaps the Germans as well could not see where they were and that the city was subject to being bombarded. It feels very special. Piece of history. I also was taken from this home periodically when the Schimmels learned that there would be a raid by the Germans looking for Jewish hidden persons. And then they would ship me off to their son, who lived outside the city in a far suburb. Olga, who was a retired policeman, had an interest in a bar which was in or near the red light district. And in that bar, there was a barmaid named Paula. And that was she became my Aunt Paula. And she visited frequently, and this was Olga's girlfriend. But she helped save me, as a matter of fact, because by virtue of her being in a bar visited by German soldiers, German policemen, she was able to find out when there would be a raid, for example. And also because she was in the bar, she was able to get access to food, and she would get access to some money, because the only people who had money during were the German soldiers and officers and so forth. My parents were ultimately in a hiding place on a main street of Amsterdam called the Centuurbaan, which is it's a belt. Centuur is a belt street.
That's the attic where my parents lived in one large room. And after October of 43, a cousin of my mother came to stay with her.
They had no idea where I was hidden or with whom. And correspondingly, the people that I was hidden with had no idea who they were hiding or where I was from. It is most hard to imagine about people being in hiding, and certainly the situation where my parents were on the main street of Amsterdam, where there were raids periodically to find hidden Jewish people, and where people were paid huge bounties to betray the Jewish people. Under those circumstances, to be in an attic without light, without heat, day in, day out with each other, every minute of every day, and every footstep, every motorized vehicle, every noise outside could be the end of your life. I think that type of terror is something that you can't reproduce in a play. You could see 100 Anne Frank plays. You can't, I don't think, replicate that kind of terror. I do have memories of the end of the war because that was just incredible. I was let out. The most significant part of all of that is that when we came outside, everybody knew that I was a hidden child, and no one on the block had betrayed us. In the meantime, the woman intermediary with the resistance told my parents where I was in hiding, and my parents left the apartment and came to find me. One of the first things my parents arranged with Ullman is that they wouldn't take me away immediately, completely, so that it took a period of days going back and forth to their hiding place, and then staying with Ullman that night. My war parents gave me their dog, Liffy, and that was very meaningful to us. It was a gesture that just indicated how much they valued being in our lives and vice versa. We ultimately went to the Velasquez Cafe, where we lived after the war. My parents were able to acquire the house that my mother's sister owned, which was occupied by German officials during the war. This was, again, my first time in going back. And this was a bit more emotional for me because I at least remembered it. That was very lucky because the owner of the house graciously let us in, and it hadn't changed a bit since the late 40s. So that was a very nice experience. This is This is the school that I attended from 1945 to 1947. We go into the courtyard where I've never been back. There were a couple of women there to pick up their children. And somehow we got to talking while we were there. There was this woman who was just blown away by our story because it matched her story.
And they had 7 children, and they hit a little child, Jewish child. So all the family could be dead.
Her grandfather had been honored at Yad Vashem for saving a Jewish child.
Whatever the consequences, you just did it. They're very brave, and I'm very proud. I have this Yad Vashem planning now, just to tell my children, what would you do in a situation like this?
It was just a totally unexpected, fortuitous, serendipitous moment that was just a highlight that day.
Oh, that's beautiful.
The thing that was so meaningful is that here we shared a story that had a message. And the message for all those people around, including the other woman that was with her there, was that there were good people doing extraordinary deeds to save other people. That kind of humanity is something that's pretty rare and rarely seen these days. And that was remarkable. Our family left Amsterdam in December 1947 to come to the U.S. We traveled with my younger brother, who was born in 1946. We landed after an 8-day trip on the Westerdam and converted Liberty boat of the Holland America line in Hoboken, New Jersey. And we moved to a house in Fort Washington, New York. It's a story of survival. We survived, and if you survive and you have the strength to survive, you can achieve anything that you want to do. Over a period of several years, I worked to document the role of the Schimmels and of a policeman named Pete Hochlo in saving me and also in saving much of my parents. Pete Hochlo saved dozens of people. Even though my mother and father found their own hiding place, he arranged fake ID to food coupons, and he arranged to provide correspondence and contact with other members of the family who were also in hiding. We managed to create their story, have it certified, audited, and reviewed by the authorities at Yad Vashem in Israel, and we arranged to have them honored as the righteous among the nations, their name inscribed on the wall at Yad Vashem. Honors were given formally with the medals and certificates in Holland on September 19th at the Jewish Historical Museum for a ceremony that was arranged by the Israeli Embassy, and there were members present of the Israeli Embassy, U.S. Cultural Attaché, the people from the Jewish Historical Museum at the Anne Frank Center, people from Stockton University.
This is my grandfather, Peter Ullman Sr. Are they heroes? Are they not heroes? I don't know. For me, they are heroes, but I think when you ask them themselves, they would have said, oh, no, we just did what was necessary.
I think that my mother-in-law never realized how dangerous it was that they hit Leo. She never mentioned it. You know, you just sort of think, you don't think about it, how dangerous it is for Leo, but also for themselves.
Today's ceremony for me was it was emotional. It already was when went to Yad a year ago, I saw their names engraved in this wall. It's getting more concrete. I knew the story all my life. But now you hear all these people and see this medal, and even more, I don't know how it's possible, even more, you realize how special it was. And they brought their own lives in danger to others. I employed it
was a very thrilling and exciting and emotional moment. There were approximately 40 relatives of the Hochul and Schumann families who attended the event. Very, very proud of them.
What was special for me during the course of this ceremony was how they captured the essence of the people who saved us.
I thought we would make a mark at Stockton. What's significant is that New Jersey requires basically the study of the Holocaust. And therefore, there was a lot of active interaction between the Resource Center and various high schools. And I had the opportunity, therefore, to meet students, which I enjoy. I like telling the story, believe it or not. And I like to see young people who are engaged and then who could relate it to their respective stories, which are often situations that are very difficult, where they've come from other countries. And often it's people who haven't been exposed to the Holocaust story at all and have never seen anybody who's alive survivor. The idea for the exhibit was, of course, to honor these people who saved our lives, who saved the lives of so many people. The Schimmels and the Hochbohms were what we would say ordinary people. They were regular people. They weren't special. They weren't designated to help people and cause people to survive the war somehow. Rather, they were people who were convinced that they were doing the right thing by helping us, helping others like us, the people that we're honoring here. They never wavered in their support.
All right. So what we're going to do now is we're going to open the floor to questions. Leo, would you like to come over here? Thank you. So, whoever is going to go first, can you please come over here and ask your questions? We'd like to be able to record the audio, so it's too far away, we might not pick up on it. So just decide in your groups who's gonna ask the question. We're gonna start with group one. So whomever is gonna be the designated speaker, can please come forward and ask your question, and then you can go and sit down. It would probably be best to also ask the follow-up questions in consist of more than one question. Screen on the whole thing, you can stand right next to your little disc. Yeah, right there.
My name is Mohammed. Nice to meet you, first of all.
Thank you.
My question is, so you and your family survived because Dutch people helped you. Still, not everyone treated you and your parents kindly. For example, your parents' relationship with the Theisters deteriorated as the war raged on and your parents' money ran out. You mentioned jealousy and the fact that your parents were expected to scrub their host family's toilets. It seemed that Opa and Oma Shimo were more hospitable. What can you say about the Theisters and Opa and Oma Shimo's motivations to help? Were these motivations different?
I do think they were different. Thank you very much for your question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much for your question. I think their motivations were different. The pastors were basically looking for money. They rented the apartment. It wasn't a hiding place that was given to them. They rented it. And it was a tolerable situation while my parents were able to pay them the rental. No one thought that the war would take 5.5 years or 4.5, 5 years. People thought maybe 6 months or so. So part of the thinking for people who took people in hiding was that it might not be so difficult. They could get through some months. But of course, the war turned out to be 4.5 years. So the Schimmels who took care of me, they were very religious folks, especially Oma Schimmel, mother. They belonged to the Dutch Reformed Church. And in that capacity, they felt very much that this was the right thing to do. But I think that was a religious conviction as much as anything else. For the Theisters, it was not. The most difficult thing with the Theisters turned out to be, this is part of your question, that they had 2 teenage daughters who my mother always thought were quite pretty. I didn't think that when I later saw their pictures, but they cooperated and palled around with German soldiers and others. And my parents were constantly afraid that advertently or inadvertently they would be betrayed. But it didn't happen. They loved those 2 girls. They taught them a lot. My parents were able to come down during the day because the people who occupied the apartment between the people who hid them on the bottom floor and my parents in the attic, they were gone during the day, and my parents could come down during the day, and they made surrogate tea bags. They sold tea bags to whoever bought them during the war. And they were made with herbs and stuff, but not true tea. But at least they did have a relationship with them for a while, but it turned. And my parents always thought that the Schimmels shook them down for food stamps, for example, which my parents were able to get because they had those fake IDs, but they wouldn't dare go out to try to use them. So the people who hid them took the food stamps, and they think they benefited from that, and my parents didn't. So it was a very, very difficult and different situation. And for my parents, the threat of being betrayed, in addition to the very fact of being in hiding, was just a constant pressure that, as you heard on the film, that kind of terror you cannot replicate in any manner, I don't think. So thank you very much for that question. I don't know if I answered it, but I think.
Yeah, no,
Okay. What is the difference between groups 1 and 2? Is it? It's not a hierarchy.
Oh, no, that's
Yeah.
absolutely not. No. In
All
every
right.
single group, there's about 2 or 3.
Okay,
The speaker of the group.
thank you.
So going into hiding, you were hiding your Jewish identity. For example, the Shimmels, when they dyed your hair, and your grandmother converted to Catholic,
Catholicism.
Catholicism. How did this experience impact your Jewish identity and the way you perceive yourself?
It's a good question. I think you expect much more of me than I can offer. Appreciate at the end of the war, I was just not even quite 6 years old yet. So I didn't have much control. What is important to me is that the Shimmels never imposed their religiosity on me. Their religious beliefs were their own, and it was much more Omas than Opa. But they never intended to make me something other than what I was. They just felt that they were caretakers, and they were not in a position to ultimately, that's another question, adopt me. They were caretakers. In terms of religiosity, my parents were never very much into their Judaism. They were Jews, and I was born a Jew, but I was never bar mitzvahed. My parents never insisted that we follow Jewish religion. When we came to America, that's another question. My parents ultimately gave up their Judaism for various reasons. So it was not a conscious decision on my part by any means. But I think much more important than religion to us, certainly when we came to America, is we wanted to be assimilated. We did not want to be different anymore. And as a Jew during the war, it's been very hard for many people that we know, including people in our family, to believe that a Jewish God would have let this happen to their people. So a lot of people left the Jewish religion because of that thought. And again, I did not focus on my history or my Jewishness until I left college, basically. I just wanted to be assimilated. Incidentally, more important than all of that was the cross. Anyway, that's a good way to become assimilated, is to play the cross. Anyway, I don't know if I answered it sufficiently, but the ultimate answer is that when we came to America, my parents gave up their Jewish religion. Not only because of the factor that I just mentioned, that the Jewish God couldn't have done this to his people. It was a little more narrow than that. My mother's sister, who had managed to leave Holland in the very first days that Hitler took over the country, when they still could get on a little boat to England, they came to America in those first days of May of 1940, and they wound up in Port Washington. And my mother's sister was a founder of the what is the largest synagogue. There are now several, but it was then the community synagogue in Port Washington. My mother's sister was a very domineering kind of woman, and my father just did not want to be in her pressure group. And so one of the reasons they did leave the Jewish religion was in part to get away from my mother's sister. And they had a good bunch of friends who were very much involved in Port Washington in community activities. My parents became very much involved in community activities, and most of those were Unitarians. So my parents became Unitarians, which in terms of religions is probably the easiest one to pursue. I don't know if that answered the question or not, but I rambled on a bit.
No, no. Great.
So, did you miss Amsterdam growing up in the United States? And did you ever consider going back, moving back to Amsterdam?
Well, I'd consider it now if Mr. Trump wins, but I wanted to go back after I finished law school. I was able to get a job in Holland, editing an international tax publication. And I loved being back in Holland. And my poor wife, who was there, we had a child when we moved to Holland, and we had one that was born in Holland. And my poor wife thought that we would not go back to the US because I was having such a good time in Holland. I didn't earn very much. We lived in the poorest part of Amsterdam. It's the only part in all of Holland where people don't speak English, I think. People left for work in the morning in wooden shoes, and they worked on tugboats and stuff. And it was we didn't have our own showers. We had community showers in a separate building. So we lived very, very, very modestly. We didn't have enough money from the job that I had to get back to the US. So my poor wife was just scared out of her mind that we wouldn't go back. My father ultimately gave us the money to come back to the US. I would never go back. I loved being there. I used to go while practicing law. I used to go back to Holland 10, 12 times a year. And I loved it. And I loved trying to keep the language, which is hard enough when you're here. But it's a different type of society from the US, very, very different. It's a socialist country. So you're taken care of. The impetus to work and to make something of yourself is much more modest in Holland. Because if you're out of work, you get 90% of your salary. And your medical is taken care of. Everybody has to belong to a medical plan, most of which are like governmental plans. Again, you're taken care of. The difference between the people who earn the most and the people who earn the least in Holland is a modest multiple. It's not the Musks and so forth that are here. It's a very great difference in terms of opportunities and in terms of what you can achieve without it being a matter of immense jealousy for everyone else. The contrast is enormous. Also, the education is totally different. There is not the kind of hierarchy there is here. The costs are minimal compared to what they are here. The difference between the universities are minimal, whether you're at the university in Groningen or in Amsterdam, it's the same. So that differentiation and that opportunity to create something of yourself by yourself, it's much less there than it is in the US.
Wow. I just wanted to thank you so much for coming out here.
Oh,
We
thank you.
all really appreciate it, and
Very nice of you.
yeah,
Thank you.
your autobiography was absolutely wonderful to read. Seriously, it was very fascinating.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you, Oma Schimmel treated you like a son, but knew she had to give you up and had prepared herself mentally for this moment. Did she ever talk to you about your parents? And did she prepare you for a possible reunion?
She did not talk to me about my parents because while in hiding, they didn't know who my parents were. They didn't know who I was. They just knew I was a Jewish kid. They had an inkling where I came from because at one point, a fellow who brought milk, in those days you got milk delivered at home, he sort of recognized me, at least that's what my folks think. And therefore they had an inkling what area of Amsterdam I came from. But other than that, they really did not know who I was or where I came from. So that really did not play as such. I think in retrospect, I don't think they ever would have thought of adopting me. I'm not sure about that, obviously, but we didn't talk about my parents because they didn't know who they were, and I'm sure they didn't want to create a fear or a longing or a potential distancing from themselves by introducing that. So no, that didn't happen. What was critical and what you saw in the movie is that when it came time to for my parents to pick me up, you have to appreciate that here I was with the Schimmels. I didn't know a war was going on. I just, I was just living there. What did I know? And again, I was 6 when the war was over. And not even yet 6. But all of a sudden, these people ring the doorbell and they looked awful. I mean, my parents had, I think maybe they weighed 70 pounds. My father had feet that were this big because he hadn't walked during that entire time. They just looked awful. And suddenly these people said they were my parents. I didn't remember them, and that was horrible. I mean, for everyone, it was difficult for me, obviously, to suddenly think that I had to go with these people who said they were my parents. And I thought, oh, my no, probably my parents. I mean, they loved me, took care of me, fed me. So that was difficult. It was also very difficult for my parents because, they knew they were my parents and I didn't know that. So it took a while. But one thing that was in the movie that was very significant was the dog. I didn't realize that until recently, actually, how meaningful that was to tie them. And Opa Schimmel, I had an eye operation shortly after the war. My eye moved. He was there during that entire time. He walked me to school every day. So they remained in our lives and have to this day. And I was on my war mother's her deathbed when she died. She reached the mid-80s. My war father died when he was in 1951, so not that long after the war. But I stayed in touch with Oma, and I always asked her, why did you do this? And she always said it was the right thing to do. It just wasn't a question. So we stayed in their lives and vice versa, and that was just very important. Still is to this day. I speak to them a lot. And I've had them come over here to tell their story. They came and spoke in Port Washington and also at the University Club in New York. It's been very important. Thank you. There are more groups. Oh, man, this is getting scary. Oh my goodness, I'm still on page 1. Thank you for getting here.
You mentioned in your memo that many people have to restore the connection that you experience in audience and like influence. We're wondering if you ever felt this comparison was just because Anne Frank, her sister, in other words, do you ever mirror your experiences to those of other victims, survivors, how doing things, how you're doing so? Thank you.
That's a good and not infrequently asked question. I want to make very clear that my story is very, very different from that of Anne Frank. Anne Frank was not Dutch. Anne Frank was a refugee from Austria, Germany, whose father had created a business in Holland, for sure, and had been there before Anne came. But Anne was in a German community in a part of Amsterdam where Germans gathered. The Dutch did not want more Germans. German people, including my father, never became citizens of Holland. They wouldn't offer them citizenship. And so the story of Anne Frank is that they were hidden in the back house of the factory that Otto Frank had. There were 8 people back there. They were doomed. Somebody had to bring in food, and there was noise, and there were people coming in and out during the day. They were doomed. So our situation was very much different from that because we had this support system. We had people like Piet Hogeboom and the Schimmels and the resistance people who made sure that that there were communications and that there were people who were helping us throughout the war. That was very different from Anne Frank in my mind. Anne Frank, of course, wrote this magnificent diary, and I'm going to tell it aside here. At one point, you may have heard, I was the head of the Anne Frank Center in the US for many years. And I was very close to, and still am, to people who run the Anne Frank House in Holland. And Mieke Gies, for example, who found the diary, and I were on television a lot, and I took her to Washington to meet with some serious politicians and so forth. But her story is not one of a support system. That support system, in my mother's case, was primarily her sorority. But while head of Anne Frank Center USA, I came in touch with the financial director of the Anne Frank House. And he was fired by the Anne Frank House. And he came to me in the US and asked if I would give him a job, and I did. And he was close still after the war with Anne Frank's father. Anne Frank's father moved to Basel, Switzerland. He remarried, and he created a foundation which has all the rights to the diary, basically, except the diary itself. But that foundation has the right to exploit the Anne Frank name and so forth. At a given moment, this man whom I hired, who was the financial director of the Anne Frank House, came to me with an envelope, a manila envelope, and in it were 5 pages of the Anne Frank diary that had never seen the light of day. And what happened was that Anne Frank's father had deleted from the diary certain pages which were quite nasty in Anne's comments about her father and mother. And also Anne Frank dealing with the fact that she was becoming a woman. And so those pages suddenly were in my hands, and this fellow asked me to take care of them. Well, I did go to law school. Nobody told me what to do with the pages of the Anne Frank diary if they gave them to you. What in the world do you do with these? I didn't know exactly what to do, but I did go to the Morgan Library to find out if these were worth anything, and if so, how much and whatever. I offered those pages to the people in Holland at the Anne Frank House, and they thought this fellow had stolen, that they weren't, that they weren't honestly given to him by Otto Frank. At any rate, since the Dutch group would not buy them or take them, we were going to auction them, and we were preparing for that. And at the last moment, Dutch government's War Documentation Center stepped in and bought them for $300,000 at the time. This is a long time ago now. It was in year 2000 or so. And those pages were subsequently authenticated and are now, if you buy the Anne Frank diary, they're in there. But those 5 pages were sort of something that were just a nice thing to deal with. So that's my Anne Frank connection.
Just a small follow-up question. Did they never think about what Otto Frank, that they respected, so they didn't really respect Otto's wishes when it came to those pages? I think it's very important that you have the whole document, and I think it should be censored. But what were your ideas about this? Do you feel that the wishes of Otto Frank should have been respected?
No,
No.
absolutely not. I think this was part of her diary. It was her thinking. It was what she wanted people to know. And the fact that it made him and his wife look bad, so be it. That's a fact.
Yeah. So they respected Anne's wishes, rather than
Right.
Otto's, yes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right.
Did we do 5?
Yes, we did. We're at 6.
We're moving right along. Thank you. Okay. No, it's a very meaningful question, and I'll try to address it. I never felt traumatized by what happened to me. The war to me was a fact. I didn't knowingly suffer, which is a very important part of my story. There are, in my mind, though people don't agree with that, I think there's a hierarchy of survivors. There are people who escaped killing camps like Auschwitz somehow, and who crawled through 100 miles of forest somehow and survived. I mean, there are those kind of stories that of people who survived under circumstances that are just unbelievable. My story was not that. I never suffered. So I don't think that I was traumatized by it. I think there are probably people who deal with mental situations, and I'm sure I have mental problems, but I don't think they relate to the war as such, at least not knowingly in my mind. I did not want, I mentioned this concept of assimilation before. For me, what was critical from the first day I came to America is that I did not want to be different. And that plays into the Judaism. I didn't want to be different. I didn't want an accent. I just did not want to be different. I did not talk about my background, whether during the war or as a foreign person, until probably late in my college years. I went to a prep school. I certainly didn't want it made known there. In that prep school, incidentally, out of a class of about 220 students, there were 4 Jews, and 2 of us were in the same room, and we hated each other. But I think that was their decision to make us Jews to sleep in the same room. At any rate, I did not knowingly suppress it because it was Judaism. I just wanted not to be different. And that's been a motivating factor. I would walk 20, 30 feet in front or behind my parents because they had an accent. In college, I joined the equivalent of a fraternity at Harvard. We had eating clubs. I was in sort of a jock club. I was a cross goalie for the 4 years I was at Harvard, and that's what I majored in. I just didn't want to be different. It's really that. That's it. Yes, ma'am. I heard, forget what happened.
Did you feel as though you wanted to forget what happened?
No. At a given moment, which was probably later in my college years, I became very, very cognizant of my background, and I am very, very focused on the story continuing. I believe what happened to me is a story that should be told, because not because of my survivor, but because of what I survived. The story of the Holocaust is something that I feel very strongly has to be told, because it conceivably could happen again. I don't really believe that, but the origins of it are certainly there constantly. So I think it's very important that my story be told, and I'm very much involved in trying to keep it alive. Thank you. No, I'm sorry.
So I was just thinking, because your experiences were really quite different from your parents with so much hardship,
Mhm.
right? I was just thinking, did you see the trauma? Because I can imagine that they experienced things very different from you. And how did you deal with that? Did you see the sorrow, the trauma in your parents as you were growing up?
Really not. My parents were very normal people, thank goodness. But they didn't talk about their experience. They rather suppressed it, and my brother and I kept urging my parents to tell their story. They wouldn't talk about it for years. But on their 40th wedding anniversary, which was in 1976, my mother wrote their story. It's a story of survival, which they wrote for my brother and for me. And that was cathartic for my parents. It completely liberated them. After they wrote that, they could talk about it without a problem. And they would talk to schools, and they would talk in their communities, and it was, they could deal with it. It was not a matter that was debilitating in any sense. It was, they dealt with it. And in the meantime, they had established a very good life. And so it was a fact of life, but it was not a determinant in any sense, I think, after they told their story.
The last question.
Hi, thank you for being here.
Next to the days on spiritual in the news, there's articles showing like more nutritionally. What is something we can do to educate others about maybe stereotypes and prejudice against groups of people at the time?
Okay, I thank you for that. I'm not sure I have the answer, but I think we have to really focus on a critical difference between what happened in the period that gave rise to the Holocaust and the situation now. Everything that happened during the Holocaust was a product of government action. It was Hitler controlling the lives of people from the moment they were born. The power of propaganda in Germany and the demonizing of the Jews as a government function is totally different from what we are experiencing today. There has been anti-Semitism or equivalent throughout history, and there will be for people who are different. And it's not just Jews. It's in certain areas it's Muslims, in certain areas it's Asians, and it's largely individualized. What we see is people disseminating bad things about all sorts of groups, but very heavily anti-Semitic. But they're individual actions, or they're groups, but it's not the government. And the government is very supportive of all actions to control all of this and to minimize it. And you'll never get rid of it altogether because people are different and religions are different. And this has gone out since the beginning of time. But I'm encouraged by the fact that we teach about the Holocaust, and we teach about differences in histories and racial backgrounds. And education is the answer. There's no other answer. And education is such a powerful means of telling stories. And we can do that. And I think we are doing it. And with organizations like this, we will continue doing it within an educational structure. So obviously I'm aware of it, and but I don't think there's anything in the way of comparison to what happened before and during the Holocaust.
I think that the second question would say, because we have 10 minutes, so I think the second question is actually maybe very good concluding question. So I think that we should just answer why I don't mind moving forward. So this is about survivors like yourself now passing away. Of course, you're going to be with us for another 20 years, right? But you know, you are one of the, because you were so young when you experienced all this, but a lot of people who have clear memories of the Holocaust are now passing away. At the Holocaust Center, one of the things that we think about is like, what can we do to preserve that memory when there's no more people who can actually tell their stories? What can we do to make sure that their memory is not forgotten?
Well, I think we have the means now of preserving memories. What we do have, I mean, you saw the film. We have all sorts of video products. We have books. We have lots of educational materials. What we also now have, which is extraordinary, is there are, golly, I forgot exactly what you would call them. There are figures created from people who are no longer with us, and you can talk to them. Have any of you seen this? Disney has done this, and Spielberg's foundation has done this. There is one now at Stockton, where they have taken people and talked to them so that they really know these people and their story, and you suddenly have in 3D a real person sitting in a chair and people asking questions, and he answered them, and he's been dead for 10 years. It's just the most phenomenal product, and it's there and it's coming. It just takes $1 million or more to create one of these persons, or maybe much more than that. But we have the ability now to take somebody and have him tell the story and answer questions, even though he's no longer alive. It's really a phenomenal opportunity. Anyway, education is the answer.
Yeah, I did not even know about that, but that was, because I know what we're talking about. I've seen it before, but I've never seen this as witness of an event.
Well, and you can ask him questions.
Yeah.
It's just phenomenal. I've seen it.
Because you would agree that the personal stories are the ones that make people connect to this part of history. And I think that after the Holocaust, you know, we started to really understand what oral history really was and how important it is to record these different stories. For example, as we now also heard, Mr. Ullman's story is very different. There's so many different nuances between these different, survivor stories. In a way, how, for example, how religious someone is, what happened to the family afterwards, it's like, or during the war, how, and so we see that there's, we need to have all these different stories out there to get a fuller and more nuanced image of what actually happened, So I think that that's why I'm so grateful that Mr. Ullman is here today to share his story. And I hope that your essays have enough material for your essays. If you have any follow-up questions, I would be so happy to send them to Mr. Ullman via email, just in case you have come across something that you really wish that you had asked. Just let me know, and I'll make sure to pass it on to Mr. Ullman. Let's just, bring the back.
Thank you all. Thank you for listening.
So class, could you please do me a favor and make sure that your name is on this? And then help yourself to some more free cookies and whatever is there, otherwise you want to throw it out, so you can just put it, use the cups for the free first down, what it is, much as you like, okay? Don't mind it.
See you around.
Yeah. I've had that since. The bids. Oh, you're doing it, right?
You know how to say,
What's that?
I'm not familiar with, no one asked me about the recording.
Yes,
Okay.
and I don't know, like, if I stop the video, I think it's gonna. Okay, so. Oh, we need to stop the recording, that's what it is here.